I will now show you a concept that is fundamental in all programming languages, the concept of functions. You already know two functions, in fact. The printf function, which is there to print something to the screen, and the scanf function, which is there to read input from the user input. I will now show you how to write your own functions. And let's start with an example. So suppose we wanted to write a function that simply adds two numbers. So a function sum, to which you pass two numbers, 3 and 4, for example, and that returns the result of adding those two numbers, 7. It's kind of a silly example because we could just simply write 3 plus 4, and that is also 7, but it's an instructional example, and it's a good example to understand how functions work. So let's get started. We need two integers a and b that will hold the numbers that we want to add, and let's have the user enter those. So let's print out, please enter two numbers, and then we use a scanf, 2%these, and ampersand a to store the first variable in a, and ampersand b to store the second variable in b. And we're now ready to somehow write our function that's supposed to add these two numbers up. But before that, let's just print out you entered %d and %d just to make sure everything was read correctly, a and b. And so you can already see a bunch of functions here. So up here is the printf function, and we call it by simply writing down the name of the function, then an opening parentheses, then arguments passed to that function, a closing parentheses, and that's about it. Similarly, here we have the scanf function. We write down the name of the function, opening parentheses, then this one has 3 arguments, in fact. The first argument being this string right here, string of characters, then a comma, another argument, a comma, and another argument, and then there's a closing parentheses. In other words, you already know how to call certain functions. In fact, you have seen one more function. It's the function called main. Every C program has to have a main function. It tells C where to start executing the code. But you can see more here. You can see how to define a function. There's a data type, and we will understand what that type is all about momentarily. A space, the name of the function, parentheses, and then here void means there's no input to this function. We will see a different example in a second. And then an opening brace, instructions, a return statement, and a closing brace. So this is the pattern that we're going to use to write our own function. So let's create some space here above the int main line, but below the pound sign include stdio.h line. So I just hit return and created a line for myself there. So we want to write a function sum that adds up two integers and returns an integer. And in order to do that, I write down the return type of the function first. This is what the function is returning, an integer. Then the name of the function, let's call it sum, opening parentheses. And now we write down the parameters that the function will receive. In our case, it receives two integers. And let's call these integers x and y. So x and y are the parameters that will hold the numbers that we're supposed to add. Then the closing parentheses put itself there automatically. Now an opening brace, and I hit return, and the closing brace appears. So this is how we start a function sum that receives two input parameters and that will return their sum. How do I find the sum now? Well, how about we have a variable compute that will store the sum, and simply we need to write compute equals x plus y. It's a very simple function. It simply adds up x and y. But why don't we also add some output so we know the function is actually working? Why don't we also print something, print starting the computation. And then after we do the computation, we can print out finished. The computation successfully. Okay. And now how do we communicate the result of the computation with the outside world? That's where this return statement comes in. In our main function, we always have a return statement and return 0, which we will understand later why we do that in a subsequent MOOC. But here, for the function sum, we want to return the result of the computation, which we called compute, which holds the result of doing x plus y. So there's our function sum. It receives two numbers, two integers. It adds up these two integers and then returns the result. So all that's left to do is in our main function to call the function sum. How do I call the function? I write down the name of the function, I open the parentheses, and then I write down the arguments that I want to pass to that function. So in our case, those are the numbers a and b. So I call it with a and b. The problem right now is that where is the result of the computation? I'm calling the function sum, but I need to store the result of the computation somewhere. In other words, I need another variable to hold this result. So how about we call it result? And if I then say result equals sum of AB, and sum of AB does its thing, and once it's finished, we return the result of the computation and store it in the variable result. Now that it's stored in the variable result, I can actually print it out. So print finished. Oops, no, I already did that. Print result of the sum equals %d, and the result goes right there. So to write a function, there are two things to do. First, you need to actually write the function, and it needs to return something if you wanted it to return something. And then you need to call the function and store the result that's being returned in a variable. So let's execute this program step by step so that we can really understand what's happening. I'm compiling and I'm starting the step-by-step execution. First, variables a and b and result are declared. Next, I'm asked to enter two numbers. And let's say we enter 3 for a and 5 for b for the second number. And we can see that in the variable editor. A now has the value 3 and b has the value 5. Next, we're going to print out we entered 3 and 5. And next, the function sum is called with arguments 3 and 5. They're stuck in there. So now all of a sudden we find ourselves in the function sum in our step-by-step execution. And here, a and b are no longer visible as variables, but instead x is there into which the value 3 has been copied. So that's a variable x now that holds the value 3, and another variable y that holds the value 5. A variable compute is declared, and we're printing out starting the computation. Next, compute is updated with the value of x plus y. Notice it's x plus y, not a plus b. A and b are not known inside the function sum. Only x and y are known there. The values of a and b have been copied and transferred over to the function sum, which holds the values 3 and 5 now in x and y. Starting the computation is printed. Computation is done. Compute holds the value 8. Finish the computation is printed. And now we're returning this value 8. And where is it being returned to? It's being returned to this variable result. So sum of a and b evaluated to 8, and that 8 is stored in the variable result. Finally, we're printing out that the result of the computation is 8, and we're done. So that's how a function works. In the next video, we'll explain in more detail how exactly the values a and b make it into the function sum.